The fluorescent lights in the Blackwater Ridge training facility buzzed with the persistent hum of electricity fighting against the humid Georgia air. At 6 in the morning, the concrete floors were already slick with condensation, and the heavy bags hanging from the reinforced ceiling beams swayed slightly in the artificial breeze from industrial fans. That did little to cut through the oppressive heat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Most people avoided places like this, the kind of facility where serious people came to learn serious skills for serious situations, where the difference between proper technique and sloppy execution could mean the difference between walking away from a confrontation and being carried away from one. The smell of sweat, rubber mats, and industrial disinfectant hung in the air like a warning to anyone who might have wandered in by mistake. Elena Vasquez pushed through the heavy glass doors at exactly 6 a.m., her worn sneakers making barely a whisper against the polished concrete. Everything about her seemed carefully designed to avoid attention. She wore simple gray athletic wear that had seen better years, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that revealed nothing more interesting than the fact that she preferred function over fashion. At 5'4" and maybe 125 pounds, soaking wet, she looked like someone who might teach elementary school or work behind the counter at a local coffee shop. There was nothing in her appearance that suggested she belonged in a place where grown men came to learn how to break bones and end fights before they really started. Nothing that indicated she had any business requesting advanced combat training from instructors who'd spent years perfecting techniques that most people hoped they'd never need to use. She carried a small gym bag that looked like it had been purchased at a discount store, and her paperwork was folded neatly in a manila envelope that she held with the careful attention of someone who understood that bureaucracy could be just as dangerous as any physical threat. The reception area was dominated by a massive desk made from what looked like repurposed oak, behind which sat a man whose neck was approximately the same diameter as most people's waists. His name tag read Dennis, but everything else about him suggested that courtesy titles were probably unnecessary. He looked up from his clipboard with the expression of someone who'd seen every type of person imaginable walk through these doors, and who'd developed reliable methods for sorting the serious from the curious. "Help you?" His voice carried the weight of someone who'd asked this question 1,000 times before and had learned to read the answers in body language rather than words. Elena approached the desk with the kind of measured pace that suggested she understood she was entering someone else's territory and was prepared to follow the established protocols. "Elena Vasquez, I have an appointment for the Level 3 Combat Readiness Assessment at 7 this morning." She placed her envelope on the desk with the precise care of someone who understood that first impressions mattered, even when you were pretty sure those impressions were going to be wrong. Dennis opened the envelope and scanned the contents with the theatrical attention of a bouncer checking IDs at a nightclub that had seen too much trouble. His eyes moved from the paperwork to Elena's face, then back to the paperwork, then up and down her frame with the kind of assessment that wasn't personal but was definitely comprehensive. Level 3? His tone suggested that she might have misunderstood something fundamental about the way the world worked. "That's our Advanced Tactical Response Program. Hand-to-hand combat, weapons disarmament, multiple attacker scenarios. You sure you're in the right place?" Elena nodded once, her expression remaining neutral despite the fact that she'd heard variations of this question approximately 700 times in the past decade. "The paperwork includes my certification requirements and payment confirmation. Everything should be in order." Dennis flipped through the pages again, clearly hoping to find some detail that would explain why someone who looked like she should be dropping kids off at soccer practice was requesting training that most people associated with military special forces and federal law enforcement. When he didn't find what he was looking for, He looked up with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have enough pieces. "Ma'am, I'm not questioning your paperwork, but level 3 isn't exactly beginner's yoga. We've had police officers wash out of this program. Military veterans who couldn't handle the intensity. You might want to consider starting with our basic self-defense courses." Elena waited patiently while Dennis delivered his warning, her posture remaining relaxed but alert. She'd learned long ago that arguing rarely changed minds, and that some battles were worth fighting, while others were simply obstacles to be navigated. When he finished speaking, she responded with the kind of calm certainty that suggested she'd given this considerable thought. "I appreciate the concern, but level 3 is exactly what I need. The authorization comes from my employer, and the training requirements are non-negotiable." Dennis studied her face for another moment, looking for signs of uncertainty or false bravado that might give him an excuse to redirect her to something more appropriate. When he didn't find any, he shrugged with the resignation of someone who'd learned that you couldn't save people from their own poor decisions. "Your funeral. Training starts in 45 minutes. You'll want to use the locker room to change into something more suitable for physical activity. And ma'am, whatever you think you know about self-defense from movies or YouTube videos, forget it. This is the real thing." Elena nodded her thanks and followed his directions toward the women's locker room, leaving Dennis to shake his head and make a note on his clipboard about the woman, who was about to learn some very expensive lessons about the difference between confidence and competence. The locker room was a study in utilitarian efficiency. Metal lockers lined the walls, separated by wooden benches that had been worn smooth by years of use. The air smelled like industrial soap and the kind of determination that comes from people pushing themselves past their perceived limitations. Elena found an empty locker and began the process of changing into clothes that were more suitable for what was about to happen. As she pulled on worn black cargo pants and a faded gray t-shirt, she caught her reflection in the mirror mounted above the sinks. What stared back at her was exactly what everyone else saw: an unremarkable woman in her early 30s, who looked like she'd be more comfortable in a boardroom than a fighting ring. There was nothing in her appearance that suggested years of training in places that didn't officially exist. Nothing that hinted at skills that had been developed under circumstances that couldn't be discussed in polite company. She tied her hair back more securely and checked her watch. 37 minutes until the assessment began. Enough time to observe the other participants and get a sense of what kind of instructor she'd be working with. Enough time to prepare mentally for the reactions she knew were coming. The main training floor was a cathedral of controlled violence. Mats covered most of the concrete, divided into sections for different types of instruction. Heavy bags hung at regular intervals, their surfaces scarred by thousands of hours of punishment. Speed bags rattled in rapid rhythms as early arrivals warmed up. In one corner, a regulation boxing ring dominated the space like an altar where people came to test their limits against each other's skills. Elena found a spot along the wall where she could watch without interfering, and settled in to observe the other candidates who'd signed up for the Level 3 assessment. They were exactly what she'd expected to see: 2 off-duty police officers, whose swagger suggested they were accustomed to having their authority respected. A private security contractor who looked like he bench-pressed small automobiles for recreation. A young Marine whose haircut was regulation, even though his clothes were civilian. All of them moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they belonged in places where physical confrontation was part of the job description. All of them looked like they could handle themselves in situations that would send ordinary people running for the exits. And all of them glanced in Elena's direction with expressions that ranged from puzzled to concerned to openly skeptical. "She's not seriously planning to go through with this, is she?" The question came from one of the police officers, spoken just loud enough that it was clearly intended to be overheard. His partner shook his head with the weary resignation of someone who'd seen too many people make decisions that were going to end badly. Probably here because her boyfriend thinks she needs to learn self-defense. The private contractor offered. His theory, while adjusting hand wraps with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. Some guys think a weekend course is going to turn their girlfriend into Lara Croft. The Marine said nothing, but Elena caught him studying her with the kind of professional assessment that suggested he'd learn to evaluate potential threats without making assumptions based on appearance. There was something in his expression that indicated he'd seen enough combat to know that danger didn't always come in the packages you expected. At exactly 7 o'clock, the instructors emerged from a side office like gladiators entering in toughly 7 o'clock. Arena. Two men who moved with the economical grace of people, who'd spent years learning how to hurt other people efficiently and professionally. The lead instructor was a man named Marcus Cole, whose reputation in law enforcement and military circles was the kind that people spoke about in hushed tones. He'd trained everyone from SWAT teams to special operations forces, and his methods were known for being both effective and unforgiving. His assistant was a younger man named Jake Rodriguez, whose credentials included tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian instruction. Together, they represented approximately 40 years of combined experience in situations where the difference between good technique and excellent technique was measured in heartbeats and hospital visits. "Good morning," Cole announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate attention and usually received it. "You're here for Level 3 Combat Readiness Assessment. Before we begin, I want to make sure everyone understands what they've signed up for." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He gestured toward a waiver station near the entrance, where legal documents waited to be signed by people who were about to voluntarily subject themselves to controlled violence. This isn't a game. This isn't a movie. This is training designed to prepare you for situations where your life or the lives of others depend on your ability to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. Elena listened to the orientation speech while observing the other participants. The police officers nodded with the confidence of people who thought they already knew what they were getting into. The contractor cracked his knuckles with anticipation. The Marine maintained the neutral expression of someone who'd learned that the best way to handle unknown situations was to stay alert and avoid making assumptions. Rodriguez stepped forward to continue the briefing. "We'll be running you through a series of scenarios designed to test your ability to handle multiple attackers, weapons threats, and close-quarters combat situations. The emphasis is on practical application rather than theoretical knowledge. You'll be working with training weapons, protective gear, and simulated ammunition. But the techniques you learn here are designed to cause serious injury or death in real-world applications." Cole's eyes swept the group, making contact with each participant to ensure they understood the gravity of what they were about to undertake. Elena met his gaze steadily, neither challenging nor deferential, simply present and ready to proceed. He paused for a moment when he reached her, clearly trying to reconcile her appearance with the advanced nature of the training she'd requested. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful but concerned, "I want to make sure you understand that Level 3 is significantly more intense than our standard programs. We've had experienced law enforcement officers find it challenging. Are you certain this is the appropriate level for your needs?" Elena had been expecting this conversation since the moment she'd walked through the door. She'd learned that people's need to protect her from her own decisions was usually well-intentioned, but rarely helpful. Her response was calm and professional, designed to convey competence without arrogance. "I understand the requirements, and I'm prepared for the intensity. My employer has specific standards that need to be met, and Level 3 is the appropriate assessment for those standards." Cole studied her face for signs of uncertainty or false confidence. looking for any indication that she might be overestimating her abilities or underestimating the challenges ahead. When he didn't find what he was looking for, he nodded with the resignation of someone who'd learned that sometimes the best way to handle skepticism was through demonstration rather than discussion. All right then, let's begin with basic assessment. We need to establish baseline capabilities before moving to advanced scenarios. Everyone pair up for initial combat drills. The pairing process was exactly what Elena had expected. The police officers naturally gravitated toward each other, assuming that their shared background would provide appropriate challenge levels. The contractor and the Marine sized each other up with the mutual respect of people who recognized serious competition when they saw it, which left Elena standing alone, clearly the odd person out in a group that had sorted itself according to perceived capability. Cole looked around the group, obviously trying to solve the problem of what to do with the woman who didn't fit neatly into any of the established categories. His solution was the kind of compromise that satisfied no one but addressed the immediate logistical challenge. Ms. Vasquez, you'll work with Rodriguez for initial assessment. We'll evaluate your baseline skills and determine appropriate pairing for advanced scenarios. Rodriguez stepped forward with the expression of someone who'd been assigned to handle a delicate situation that no one else wanted to deal with. He was professional and courteous, but Elena could see the concern in his eyes, the kind of worry that came from being responsible for someone who might be about to get seriously hurt. Ma'am, we'll start with basic defensive positions and work our way up from there. The goal is to establish your comfort level with physical contact and your ability to execute fundamental techniques under pressure. Elena nodded and followed him to an open section of the mat, aware that every other person in the room was watching to see how this was going to play out. The attention wasn't malicious, but it was definitely focused. Everyone wanted to know whether the woman who looked like she should be teaching second grade was about to embarrass herself in front of people whose opinions mattered in their professional lives. Rodriguez began with the basics, demonstrating proper stance, balance, and defensive positioning. His instruction was clear and patient, the kind of teaching that came from years of working with people who had varying levels of experience and ability. Elena followed his guidance, mirroring his movements with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered. But there was something in the way she moved that caught his attention. Her balance was too good, her positioning too precise, her responses too immediate for someone who was supposed to be learning these concepts for the first time. When he demonstrated a basic block, she executed it with muscle memory that suggested years of practice. When he showed her how to pivot and create distance, she moved with the efficiency of someone who'd performed these movements thousands of times before. You've done this before, Rodriguez observed, his tone shifting from instructional to curious. Elena's response was carefully neutral, neither confirming nor denying his suspicion. I've had some basic training, nothing formal. Rodriguez studied her more carefully, looking for signs that would explain the disconnect between her appearance and her obvious competence. What he saw didn't match what he'd expected. Her movements were economical and precise, without the exaggerated motions that characterized people who'd learned techniques from movies or videos. Her breathing was controlled, her focus absolute. Let's try something a little more advanced, he suggested, his voice carrying a new note of professional interest. I'm going to come at you with a basic attack, and I want you to show me how you'd respond. Nothing fancy, just whatever feels natural. Elena nodded and reset her position, her body language shifting subtly from student to practitioner. Rodriguez approached with a telegraphed punch that was designed to test basic defensive responses rather than present a real threat. What happened next caused every conversation in the room to stop. Elena didn't just block the attack. She redirected Rodriguez's momentum, used his forward motion against him, and put him on the ground with a technique that was so smooth and efficient that It looked almost casual. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and ended with Rodriguez flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling with the expression of someone who'd just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the situation was wrong. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when people witness something that doesn't fit into their understanding of how the world is supposed to work. Elena offered Rodriguez her hand and helped him to his feet, her expression apologetic but not particularly surprised by what had just happened. "Sorry," she said quietly. "You said to do whatever felt natural." Rodriguez accepted her help getting up, his mind racing to process what he'd just experienced. The technique she'd used wasn't something you learned in a weekend self-defense course. It was advanced, sophisticated, and executed with the kind of precision that suggested years of serious training. Cole had stopped his own instruction and was walking over to see what had caused the sudden quiet in his training facility. When Rodriguez caught his eye, the younger instructor's expression conveyed more information than words could have managed. Something significant had just happened, and they needed to reassess their understanding of who they were dealing with. "Everything okay over here?" Cole asked, his tone casual but his attention completely focused on Elena. She remained in a relaxed, ready position, neither aggressive nor defensive, simply present and alert. "Just running through basic defensive responses," Rodriguez replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Miss Vasquez demonstrates some interesting technique variations." Cole looked from his assistant to Elena, reading the subtext in Rodriguez's words. Interesting technique variations was instructor code for this person, knows significantly more than we initially assumed. "Mind showing me what you just demonstrated?" Cole asked, his request polite but carrying the weight of professional authority. Elena glanced around the room, suddenly aware that every other participant had stopped their own training to watch what was happening on her section of the mat. She was at a crossroads. She could continue to downplay her abilities, stick to the role of modest student seeking basic instruction, and probably complete the assessment without drawing further attention to herself. Or she could demonstrate the skills that had brought her here in the first place and deal with the consequences of people realizing they'd made assumptions that were completely wrong. The decision was made for her when Cole stepped forward with the confident aggression of someone who'd spent 20 years learning how to handle situations exactly like this one. His attack was faster and more committed than Rodriguez's had been, designed to test whether her previous demonstration had been luck or skill. Elena responded with the same fluid efficiency she'd shown before, but this time the technique was more complex. She didn't just redirect Cole's attack. She controlled it, managed his balance, and put him in a position where continuing the confrontation would have resulted in serious injury for him. The entire sequence demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that belonged in military special operations training rather than civilian self-defense classes. Cole found himself in a submission hold that he recognized but couldn't immediately counter, applied with the kind of precision that suggested she could have escalated the technique to cause permanent damage if she'd chosen to. For a moment, the instructor who'd trained Special Forces operators around the world was completely at the mercy of a woman who looked like she should be organizing bake sales. Elena released the hold immediately and stepped back, her expression conveying professional respect rather than triumph. Cole regained his footing and looked at her with new eyes, seeing past the unremarkable appearance to recognize the unmistakable signs of someone who'd been trained by people who understood violence at the highest levels. "Where did you learn to do that?" The question came from the Marine, whose professional interest had overcome his inclination to remain silent. Elena turned to face him, and for the first time since entering the facility, allowed a hint of her real competence to show in her expression. "Here and there," she replied, the neutrality of her tone suggesting that here and there include places that didn't appear on civilian maps and situations that weren't discussed in polite company. Cole was studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more interesting. "Ma'am, I think we need to have a conversation about your background and training objectives. That wasn't basic self-defense. And you're clearly not here for beginner instruction." Elena nodded, understanding that her cover had been blown and that continuing to pretend otherwise would only insult the intelligence of people who clearly knew what they were looking at. The conversation Cole was requesting would have to wait, because at that moment, the facility's emergency alert system activated with the harsh, electronic tone that indicated an immediate and serious threat. Everyone in the room froze as the intercom crackled to life with the voice of Dennis from the front desk, his earlier casual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. "Code red. All personnel. We have multiple armed intruders in the building. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Multiple armed hostiles have breached the facility. All training activities cease immediately. Everyone move to the safe room in the basement level." The transformation that swept through the room was immediate and total. The police officers reached instinctively for weapons that weren't there, forgetting momentarily that they were off-duty and in civilian clothes. The contractor dropped into a tactical crouch, his eyes scanning for exits and cover positions. The Marine's military training kicked in as he began assessing the situation with the systematic approach of someone who'd dealt with hostile contact before. But it was Elena who moved first, while everyone else was still processing the announcement and deciding how to respond. She was already in motion toward the facility's main entrance. Her movement was swift and purposeful, like someone who'd trained for scenarios exactly like this one and knew that the difference between survival and disaster was often measured in the seconds it took people to overcome their initial shock and begin taking action. "Ma'am, wait," Cole called after her, his instructor instincts warring with his tactical knowledge. The safe room was in the opposite direction, and everything in his training told him that civilians should be moving away from threats rather than toward them. Elena paused just long enough to look back at the group, and in that moment, everyone in the room saw something that made them understand they'd been completely wrong about who she was. Her expression had shifted from the carefully neutral mask she'd maintained all morning to something else entirely. Professional, predatory, absolutely confident. "Stay here," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone instinctively want to follow her instructions. "Keep everyone in the safe room until this is over." The way she said it suggested that she had very specific ideas about how this was going to end, and that those ideas didn't involve hiding in a basement while other people handled the problem. Rodriguez found his voice first. "Ma'am, you can't just walk toward armed intruders. This isn't a training scenario. These are real weapons with real bullets and real people who are prepared to use them." Elena was already at the door, leading to the main corridor, her hand on the handle. "I know exactly what they are," she replied, and something in her tone made it clear that this conversation was over. She pushed through the door and disappeared into the hallway, leaving behind a room full of combat-trained professionals who suddenly realized they had no idea who they'd been sharing space with for the past hour. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the building approximately 30 seconds later, followed by shouting voices and the crash of equipment being overturned. Cole made the decision to ignore Elena's instructions and follow her, his responsibility for facility security overriding his concern for personal safety. Rodriguez was right behind him, and the other participants formed a loose group that moved toward the sound of conflict rather than away from it. What they found, when they reached the main corridor, defied everything they thought they understood about how these situations were supposed to unfold. Elena was moving through the facility like a force of nature, engaging multiple attackers, with techniques that belonged in special operations rather than civilian self-defense. She wasn't just fighting. She was controlling the entire tactical situation with the kind of systematic precision that suggested extensive training in close-quarters combat. The intruders had clearly expected to encounter civilian resistance at worst, possibly some off-duty security personnel who might be armed and trained enough to present a moderate challenge. What they hadn't expected was someone who moved through their formation like she'd been planning this specific engagement for years, someone who turned their weapons against them and used their own tactical positioning to isolate and neutralize them one by one. Cole watched in stunned silence as Elena disarmed the first attacker with a technique that was so fast and efficient that the man's weapon was in her hands before he fully understood what had happened. She used his own rifle to provide cover, while she closed distance on the second attacker, whose body armor and tactical gear provided no protection against someone who knew exactly where and how to strike to cause immediate incapacitation. The third and fourth attackers tried to flank her, moving with the coordination of people who'd trained together and knew how to support each other in close combat situations. Elena responded by using the facility's layout against them, channeling their movement into a choke point where their numerical advantage became a liability. What followed was a demonstration of tactical awareness and combat skill that belonged in classified training videos rather than civilian facilities. Rodriguez counted 8 attackers in total, all of them equipped with military-grade weapons and body armor that suggested serious financial backing and professional planning. Elena engaged all of them in a running battle that lasted exactly 15 seconds, and when it was over, every single hostile was on the ground, either unconscious or in too much pain to continue fighting. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Elena checking each neutralized attacker to ensure they weren't capable of rejoining the fight. Her movements were methodical and professional, like someone conducting a post-engagement assessment according to procedures that had been drilled into her muscle memory through years of repetition. When she was satisfied that the immediate threat had been eliminated, she turned to face the group of shocked observers who'd followed her into what should have been a deadly confrontation. Her expression was calm and controlled, showing no signs of the adrenaline that should have been coursing through her system after single-handedly defeating 8 armed attackers. "Facility is secure," she announced, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a routine status report. "You'll want to contact local law enforcement and emergency medical services. Some of these individuals will require medical attention." Cole looked around at the aftermath of what had just occurred, trying to process the fact that a woman he'd assumed was a civilian seeking basic self-defense training had just neutralized a coordinated attack by multiple armed hostiles. The attackers' weapons were scattered across the floor, and their bodies were arranged in positions that suggested they'd been systematically disabled by someone who understood exactly how to render armed opponents harmless without necessarily killing them. "Who are you?" The question came from the Marine, whose combat experience had given him enough background to recognize truly exceptional skills when he witnessed them. Elena looked at him with the same neutral expression she'd maintained throughout the morning, but now it carried implications that hadn't been apparent before. "Just someone who needed level 3 assessment," she replied, her tone suggesting that this answer was both completely accurate and entirely insufficient to explain what they'd just witnessed. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that someone had called for emergency response, and Elena walked toward the facility's exit with the same purposeful stride she'd maintained since arriving that morning. As she passed Cole, she paused long enough to make one final observation. "Your training programs are quite good, but you might want to consider adding scenarios that involve multiple armed attackers. In real situations, threats rarely come one at a time." Cole nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened. When he looked up to respond, Elena was already gone, having disappeared into the Georgia morning as quietly and efficiently as she'd handled everything else. The police arrived 7 minutes later to find 8 unconscious suspects, a room full of shaken but unharmed witnesses, and absolutely no sign of the woman who'd single-handedly prevented what could have been a massacre. Dennis provided what details he could from the security footage, but the cameras had malfunctioned during the crucial 15 seconds when Elena had engaged the attackers, leaving only the aftermath as evidence of what had occurred. The federal agents who arrived 2 hours later asked very specific questions about the woman, who'd requested Level 3 assessment, questions that suggested they knew more about Elena Vasquez than they were willing to discuss with local law enforcement. When they left, they took all the security footage with them, along with strict instructions that the details of the incident were not to be discussed with media or unauthorized personnel. Cole spent the rest of the day trying to understand what had happened in his facility, but the official report he eventually filed was sanitized of any details that might have raised uncomfortable questions about the woman who'd appeared from nowhere, demonstrated impossible skills, and disappeared just as completely. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread through law enforcement and military networks in the form of whispered conversations and unofficial reports. Story grew in the telling, becoming the kind of legend that people shared in training facilities and military bases around the world. But the central facts remained consistent. Someone had walked into a civilian training facility, been underestimated by everyone present, and then demonstrated capabilities that belonged in the highest levels of special operations. Rodriguez eventually left Blackwater Ridge to join a federal agency, whose existence was acknowledged but whose activities remained classified. In his farewell conversation with Cole, he mentioned that he'd learned something important about assumptions and the danger of judging people based on appearances rather than capabilities. The Marine requested advanced training that went far beyond anything offered in civilian facilities, explaining to his recruiter that he'd witnessed a demonstration of skills that had shown him how much he still needed to learn. His subsequent career in special operations was marked by the kind of exceptional performance that suggested he'd taken those lessons to heart. The police officers returned to their regular duties with a new appreciation for the fact that threats could come from any direction and that survival often depended on recognizing danger before it recognized you. Their performance evaluations noted significant improvements in tactical awareness and response times, though they never explained what had motivated these changes. Cole continued to run his training facility, but he instituted new policies regarding the assessment of incoming students. Instead of making assumptions based on appearance or background, instructors were required to conduct thorough evaluations that measured actual capability rather than perceived potential. The changes were subtle but significant, reflecting lessons learned from a morning when everything they thought they knew about combat readiness had been proven inadequate. Elena Vasquez herself disappeared completely from any official records, becoming another ghost story in a world where the most capable people were often the ones nobody talked about. But her impact remained in the form of improved training protocols, revised assessment procedures, and a new understanding among professional instructors that excellence could appear in the most unexpected packages. The weapons used by the attackers were eventually traced to a network of arms dealers who specialized in providing equipment for high-risk operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The investigation revealed connections to several ongoing federal cases, but the details remained classified and the ultimate source of the threat was never publicly identified. What remained was the story of 15 seconds that had changed everything for everyone involved. 15 seconds when assumptions were shattered, preconceptions were destroyed, and a group of professional fighters learned that they still had much to learn about what was possible when skill met necessity in circumstances that demanded immediate action. In the end, the incident at Blackwater Ridge became part of the unofficial curriculum at training facilities around the world, used as an example of why instructors should never underestimate students based on appearance, and why the most dangerous people were often the ones who looked least threatening. It served as a reminder that in a world where violence was always a possibility, The ability to recognize and respect true competence could be the difference between survival and disaster. And somewhere out there, Elena Vasquez continued whatever mission had brought her to a civilian training facility on a humid Georgia morning, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd kept her promise to herself and to the people whose safety had depended on her ability to be more than anyone expected her to be. 3 weeks after the incident at Blackwater Ridge, FBI Special Agent Sarah Chun sat in a conference room that didn't officially exist, reviewing files that would never appear in any public database. The room was located on the 7th floor of a federal building in downtown Atlanta, behind doors that required 3 different security clearances to access and biometric scans that verified identity down to the cellular level. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the mahogany table, where classified documents were spread in careful arrangements that told a story most people would never be allowed to read. Each file folder was marked with stamps and codes that indicated levels of secrecy reserved for operations that affected national security but could never be acknowledged by any government agency. Chun had been with the Bureau for 12 years, long enough to have seen cases that challenged everything she thought she knew about how the world really worked. She'd investigated domestic terrorism, international espionage, and criminal networks that operated across multiple continents with the kind of sophistication that rivaled legitimate governments. But the folder she was currently studying contained information that pushed the boundaries of even her extensive experience with the impossible. The subject's name was listed as Elena Maria Vasquez, though the documentation suggested that this identity was as carefully constructed as everything else about her. Born in El Paso, Texas, 32 years ago to parents whose own backgrounds contained gaps that raised more questions than they answered. Education records that showed a brilliant academic career, followed by military service that became increasingly classified as time progressed. What made the file truly extraordinary wasn't what it contained, but what it didn't contain. Entire years of Elena's life were redacted behind black bars that indicated information too sensitive to share even within the intelligence community. Her military records showed deployments to locations that were listed only as classified operational areas, missions that were described in terms so vague they could have meant anything from humanitarian assistance to covert warfare. Chun turned to the incident report from Blackwater Ridge, which had been filed by local law enforcement and then immediately classified under national security protocols. According to the official version, 8 armed suspects had attempted to rob a private training facility and had been subdued by facility security before any injuries occurred. The suspects were currently being held in federal custody, pending investigation of their connections to international arms trafficking networks. The unofficial version, which existed only in witness statements that had been sealed and classified, painted a very different picture. According to multiple credible sources, a single woman had neutralized all 8 attackers in approximately 15 seconds, using hand-to-hand combat techniques that suggested military special operations training at the highest levels. Video surveillance from the facility had mysteriously malfunctioned during the crucial moments, leaving only the aftermath as evidence of what had occurred. But the physical evidence was compelling enough to convince federal investigators that they were dealing with someone whose capabilities went far beyond anything available through civilian training programs. Chun's partner, Agent David Rodriguez, entered the conference room carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he'd spent the morning reviewing equally disturbing information. Rodriguez had been with the Bureau for 8 years, specializing in cases that involved former military personnel who'd transitioned to civilian life, while retaining skills that could be dangerous in the wrong circumstances. "Any luck tracking down our mystery woman?" Chun asked, accepting one of the coffee cups and gesturing toward the files spread across the table. Rodriguez shook his head, settling into the chair across from her with the weary resignation of someone who'd spent hours chasing leads that went nowhere. Elena Vasquez disappeared completely after leaving the training facility. No credit card usage, no cell phone activity, no traffic camera sightings. Her apartment in Atlanta was cleared out within hours of the incident, and the landlord says she paid 3 months' rent in advance when she moved in, all cash, no questions asked. Chun wasn't surprised by this information. People with Elena's apparent background didn't survive by leaving trails that could be followed by law enforcement agencies, even friendly ones. They lived in the spaces between official oversight and unofficial necessity, appearing when needed and disappearing when their work was complete. What about the attackers? Any progress identifying who sent them or what they were after? Rodriguez pulled out his own file and opened it to reveal photographs of the 8 men who'd been neutralized at Blackwater Ridge. Their faces showed the kind of damage that came from encounters with someone who understood exactly how to disable opponents without necessarily killing them. All 8 are foreign nationals with connections to private military contractors that operate in regions where governments prefer to maintain plausible deniability. No official criminal records, but intelligence suggests they've been involved in operations that would be considered war crimes if they'd occurred in acknowledged conflicts. Chun studied the photographs, noting the systematic nature of the injuries. Each attacker had been disabled in a way that suggested intimate knowledge of human anatomy and the precise application of force needed to render someone unconscious without causing permanent damage. The techniques used were consistent with military training that went far beyond anything taught in conventional programs. Any indication what they were after at the training facility? Rodriguez shook his head, but his expression suggested that this question had been bothering him since the investigation began. That's what doesn't make sense. Blackwater Ridge is a legitimate business that provides training to law enforcement and private security personnel. Nothing classified, nothing that would attract international attention. The only unusual thing about that particular morning was Elena Vasquez requesting Level 3 assessment. The implications of this observation hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. If the attackers had been targeting Elena specifically, it suggested that her presence at the facility hadn't been coincidental. But it also raised questions about how they'd known she would be there, and what they'd hoped to accomplish by confronting someone with her apparent capabilities. Chun turned to another section of the file, which contained reports from federal agencies that officially didn't coordinate with local law enforcement on domestic matters. The information was heavily redacted, but enough remained to suggest that Elena Vasquez wasn't just a former military operator who'd transitioned to civilian life. According to these reports, she was part of a program that didn't exist, trained for missions that were never officially conducted, and deployed to handle situations that required the kind of plausible deniability that only came from using people who could never be traced back to any government agency. David, look at this. Chun pointed to a section of the report that had caught her attention. 3 other incidents in the past 6 months involving individuals with similar backgrounds. All of them occurred at civilian facilities where former special operations personnel were conducting routine activities. All of them involved coordinated attacks by unidentified foreign nationals. Rodriguez leaned forward to examine the information, his expression growing more concerned as he processed the implications. Someone is systematically targeting people with specific skill sets, probably trying to eliminate threats before they can be deployed against whatever operation they're planning. The pattern was becoming clear, and it painted a picture that made both agents uncomfortable. Someone with significant resources and international connections was conducting what amounted to a preemptive strike against people whose existence was supposed to be secret. The fact that they'd been unsuccessful so far suggested either poor intelligence or significant underestimation of their target's capabilities. "We need to find Elena Vasquez before they do," Chun said, stating the obvious conclusion that both of them had reached. If she's part of whatever program these files are hinting at, she's probably not the only target, and the next attack might be more successful. Rodriguez was already reaching for his phone to contact the federal agencies that coordinated responses to threats against classified personnel. But Chun suspected that Elena Vasquez was exactly where she needed to be, doing whatever job had brought her to a civilian training facility on a morning when 8 armed attackers had made the mistake of underestimating someone whose capabilities existed in the shadows between official acknowledgement and necessary action. 200 miles away, in a small mountain town in North Carolina that most people drove through without stopping, Elena Vasquez sat in a diner that hadn't changed its decor since the 1970s. The red vinyl booths were cracked from age. The linoleum floor was worn thin by decades of foot traffic, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. She occupied a corner booth that provided clear sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen, her back to the wall in a position that had become second nature after years of operating in environments where situational awareness was the difference between completing the mission and becoming a casualty statistic. The local newspaper was spread on the table in front of her, but Elena's attention was focused on the reflection in the window beside her booth. She was watching a man in a dark sedan who'd been following her for the past 3 hours, maintaining professional distance while conducting surveillance that was competent, but not quite good, enough to avoid detection by someone with her training. Elena had spotted the tail shortly after leaving her motel that morning, and had spent the intervening hours leading him through a series of maneuvers designed to confirm his presence and assess his capabilities. He was good enough to be federal law enforcement, but not quite good enough to be one of the people who'd been hunting her for the past 6 months. The waitress approached with a coffee pot and the kind of friendly efficiency that characterized small-town service. She was a woman in her 50s who'd probably been working at this diner for most of her adult life, someone who'd seen enough travelers pass through to recognize when someone was just passing through versus when they might be running from something. "More coffee, honey." The waitress's voice carried the warmth of someone who understood that sometimes people needed a friendly word from a stranger, even if they couldn't explain why they needed it. "Please." Elena turned from the window to smile at the older woman, allowing herself a moment of genuine human connection in a life that had become increasingly isolated by necessity. The coffee was surprisingly good, and the brief interaction reminded her of what she was ultimately fighting to protect. "You traveling far?" the waitress asked, her question carrying the kind of casual curiosity that characterized conversations in places where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Just passing through." Elena's response was polite, but didn't invite further conversation. The waitress nodded with understanding, recognizing the tone of someone who had places to be and couldn't afford to get comfortable in any one location for too long. After the waitress moved on to other customers, Elena returned her attention to the reflection in the window. The man in the sedan was still there, but his body language had changed. He was talking into a communication device, probably reporting her location to whoever was coordinating the surveillance operation. Elena left money on the table and walked toward the diner's rear exit, moving with the casual pace of someone who wasn't particularly concerned about being followed, but also wasn't going to make it easy for her pursuers. The back door opened onto an alley that connected to a network of side streets that would allow her to test whether her tail was working alone or as part of a larger team. What she discovered over the next 20 minutes was that the surveillance operation was more sophisticated than she'd initially assumed. The man in the sedan was part of a coordinated effort that involved at least 4 vehicles and possibly aircraft support. The level of resources being devoted to tracking her movements suggested federal law enforcement rather than the international operators who'd been hunting people with her background. Elena made a decision that reflected both her training and her understanding of the current situation. Instead of continuing to evade surveillance, she would confront it directly and determine whether these people represented a threat or an opportunity to gather information about the larger pattern of attacks against former Special Operations personnel. She chose her ground carefully, selecting a parking lot behind a closed manufacturing facility that provided clear sight lines in all directions and limited approaches that would force her pursuers to reveal their numbers and capabilities. The location also offered multiple escape routes if the confrontation didn't go as planned. Elena positioned herself near a loading dock that provided both cover and elevation, then waited for her surveillance team to realize that their target had stopped moving and begun acting in ways that suggested she was aware of their presence. The response came within minutes, as vehicles converged on the area with the coordination of people who'd done this type of operation many times before. What emerged from the vehicles was exactly what Elena had expected to see. 4 federal agents, in conservative business attire, moving with the careful professionalism of people who understood they were approaching someone with unknown but potentially dangerous capabilities. Their weapons were holstered but easily accessible, and their positioning suggested training in tactical operations that went beyond standard law enforcement protocols. The lead agent was a woman in her late 30s who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most competent person in the room. Her approach was direct but non-threatening, designed to initiate conversation rather than confrontation. "Ms. Vasquez, I'm Special Agent Chun with the FBI. We'd like to speak with you about the incident at Blackwater Ridge." Elena remained in position on the loading dock, her posture relaxed but ready to move if the situation deteriorated. "I'm listening." Her response was neutral, neither hostile nor cooperative, designed to gather information about their intentions before committing to any course of action. Agent Chun stopped at a distance that was close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid appearing threatening. Her body language suggested someone who understood they were dealing with a person whose capabilities were unknown but potentially significant. "We're investigating a pattern of attacks against individuals with backgrounds similar to yours. We believe you may be able to provide information that could help us prevent future incidents." Elena studied the 4 agents, reading their positioning and equipment to assess whether this was a legitimate law enforcement contact or something more complicated. "What kind of information?" Her question was designed to determine how much these people actually knew about her background and the circumstances that had brought her to the training facility where the attack had occurred. Agent Chun's response revealed both the scope of the federal investigation and the limitations of their understanding. "We know that you neutralized 8 armed attackers using techniques that suggest advanced military training. We also know that similar attacks have occurred at other locations involving people with comparable backgrounds." Elena processed this information, understanding that the federal agencies were aware of the pattern, but might not understand the larger context and explained why former Special Operations personnel were being targeted. Her response was carefully calculated to provide enough information to be helpful without revealing details that could compromise ongoing operations. The people who attacked the training facility weren't random criminals. They were professionals, sent to eliminate specific targets before those targets could be deployed against whatever operation they're planning. Agent Chun nodded, indicating that this assessment matched their own analysis of the situation. "That's consistent with our investigation. We're trying to identify who's coordinating these attacks and what their ultimate objective might be." Elena understood that she'd reached another decision point. She could continue to operate independently, relying on her own resources and training to handle whatever threats emerged. Or she could provide limited cooperation with federal law enforcement in exchange for access to their intelligence resources and investigative capabilities. The decision was influenced by her awareness that the attacks were escalating in sophistication and coordination. The 8 men who'd targeted her at Blackwater Ridge had been better equipped and more professionally trained than the attackers in previous incidents. Someone was learning from their failures and adapting their tactics accordingly. I might be able to help, but I'll need access to your files on the other incidents. And I'll need assurance that this cooperation doesn't compromise ongoing operations that you don't have clearance to know about. Agent Chun's expression indicated that she'd expected this kind of conditional cooperation from someone with Elena's background. That can be arranged, but it will require approval from agencies above my level. Are you willing to meet with people who have the authority to make those decisions? Elena considered the implications of deeper involvement with federal agencies whose oversight responsibilities might conflict with the independence she needed to complete her mission. One meeting. No commitments beyond sharing information that might prevent future attacks. If your people try to turn this into something larger, I disappear and you won't find me again. Agent Chun nodded, understanding that this was probably the best offer they were going to receive from someone whose existence operated in the spaces between official acknowledgement and necessary action. Agreed. I'll arrange a meeting with the appropriate personnel. Can you be at the federal building in Atlanta tomorrow at 10 in the morning? Elena shook her head, her expression indicating that she wouldn't be walking into any federal facility without significantly more assurance about her safety and the nature of the meeting. Neutral location. I'll contact you with details once I've had time to verify that this cooperation is in everyone's best interest. She provided Agent Chun with a phone number that would be functional for exactly 24 hours before being disconnected and replaced by routing that couldn't be traced. Agent Chun accepted the terms, understanding that someone with Elena's background wouldn't survive long if they made a habit of trusting people they just met. The federal investigation needed Elena's cooperation, but it would have to be on terms that respected her operational security and the realities of her situation. As the agents returned to their vehicles and departed the area, Elena remained in position for another 20 minutes, ensuring that the surveillance operation had actually ended rather than simply transitioning to more covert methods. When she was satisfied that she was no longer being watched, she made her way to a vehicle she'd positioned several blocks away as part of her contingency planning. The drive back to her current safe house took her through mountain roads that provided multiple opportunities to detect and evade any pursuit that might have been coordinated despite her precautions. Elena used the time to consider the implications of potential cooperation with federal law enforcement and the intelligence it might provide about the larger pattern of attacks. Her assessment was that the benefits outweighed the risks, provided she maintained operational independence and didn't allow federal oversight to compromise her ability to respond to threats as they emerged. The people hunting former special operations personnel were escalating their activities, and stopping them would require resources and intelligence that went beyond what any individual operator could access independently. But cooperation would also mean revealing aspects of her background and capabilities that she'd spent years keeping hidden. It would mean trusting people whose loyalty was to institutions rather than the mission that had brought her to a civilian training facility. On a morning when 8 armed attackers had learned that their intelligence about their target had been catastrophically inadequate, Elena reached her safe house as the sun was setting over the North Carolina mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of places she'd operated where the beauty of the landscape couldn't disguise the danger that waited in every shadow. She had 12 hours to decide whether cooperation with federal law enforcement was worth the risk of exposure, or whether the threat she was facing required the kind of independent action that operated outside the constraints of official oversight. The decision would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of other former operators who were being systematically targeted by people whose ultimate objectives remained hidden behind layers of international financing and professional operational security. Elena understood that she was fighting a war that most people didn't know existed, against enemies who used the shadows between nations as their battlefield. Tomorrow she would find out whether the federal government was prepared to acknowledge that some fights required people who operated in those same shadows, or whether she would continue to wage this war alone, using skills that officially didn't exist against threats that couldn't be officially recognized. The mountain air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of pine trees and the promise of winter weather that would soon make travel more difficult. Elena secured her safe house using procedures that had been refined through years of operating in hostile territory, then settled in to monitor communications and intelligence sources that would help her understand whether the federal interest in her activities represented opportunity or threat. In Atlanta, Agent Chun was briefing her supervisors on the contact with Elena Vasquez and the conditions under which limited cooperation might be possible. The conversation took place in the same secure conference room where classified files told stories that would never be shared with the public, and the decisions being made would affect operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The people around the conference table represented multiple federal agencies, whose jurisdictions overlapped in the murky areas where national security intersected with law enforcement and intelligence operations. Their discussion centered on whether someone with Elena's background could be trusted with information about ongoing investigations, and whether the intelligence she might provide was worth the risk of exposing federal operations to someone whose ultimate loyalty was unknown. The consensus was that the threats being faced required resources and capabilities that existed outside traditional law enforcement and intelligence channels. Elena Vasquez represented access to a network of former special operations personnel, whose skills and experience were exactly what was needed to counter threats that operated with similar capabilities and training. But bringing her into the official investigation would require acknowledging that some problems couldn't be solved through conventional means, and that national security sometimes depended on people whose methods and objectives couldn't be subject to normal oversight and accountability. The decision was made to proceed with limited cooperation, understanding that Elena Vasquez would remain independent and that her involvement would be deniable if operations went in directions that couldn't be officially supported. Agent Chun was authorized to share specific intelligence about the pattern of attacks and to coordinate limited tactical support for operations that Elena might conduct in response to emerging threats. What remained to be seen was whether Elena would accept these terms, or whether she would decide that the risks of cooperation outweighed the benefits of access to federal resources and intelligence. Either way, the war being fought in the shadows would continue, with or without official acknowledgement of the people who were fighting it. The next morning brought news that changed the calculation for everyone involved. Another attack had occurred, this time targeting a former Air Force Special Operations pilot who'd been conducting routine business at a private airfield in Texas. Unlike previous incidents, this attack had been successful, resulting in the death of someone whose skills and experience represented years of investment in capabilities that couldn't be replaced. Elena received the news through communication channels that existed outside official oversight, but she understood that federal law enforcement would have access to the same information through their own sources. The escalation represented by a successful assassination meant that the threats were becoming more sophisticated and that the window for effective response was closing rapidly. She made the phone call to Agent Chun exactly 24 hours after their initial contact, providing coordinates for a meeting location that would allow for secure communication while maintaining her operational security. The conversation would determine whether cooperation with federal law enforcement could provide the resources needed to stop the attacks, or whether the fight would continue to be waged by individuals whose existence operated in the spaces between official acknowledgement and necessary action. The war in the shadows was escalating, and the decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether the people being systematically targeted would receive the support they needed or whether they would continue to face threats that grew more sophisticated with each attack. Elena understood that her choice would affect not just her own survival, but the survival of others whose service to their country had earned them enemies who operated with the kind of resources and coordination that suggested state-level support. The mountain morning was cold and clear, with frost covering the ground and mist rising from the valleys below. Elena prepared for a meeting that would either provide the intelligence and resources needed to end the threat, or confirm that she would continue to fight this war alone, using skills that officially didn't exist against enemies who couldn't be officially acknowledged. Either way, the fight would continue, because some promises couldn't be broken and some duties couldn't be abandoned, even when the cost of keeping faith with those obligations required operating in the shadows between law and necessity, between official oversight and the kind of action that kept people safe without ever receiving recognition or acknowledgement. The sun rose over the North Carolina mountains, illuminating a landscape that had witnessed countless struggles between people who fought for principles they couldn't always explain to people who would never understand the price of the freedoms they took for granted. Elena gathered her equipment and prepared to meet with people who might become allies or might represent another threat to navigate, understanding that survival depended on making the right choice in circumstances where the wrong decision could be fatal. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Charlotte sat like a monument to industrial decline, its broken windows and rusted metal siding bearing witness to decades of economic change that had left entire neighborhoods empty and forgotten. The morning fog clung to the building's walls, creating an atmosphere that was both desolate and strangely peaceful. Elena arrived at the coordinates she'd provided to Agent Chun 40 minutes early, using the time to conduct surveillance and ensure that the federal agents hadn't brought unwanted company to what was supposed to be a secure meeting. The warehouse provided excellent sight lines in all directions, while offering multiple escape routes if the situation developed in ways that required immediate departure. She positioned herself on the building's second floor, behind windows that had lost their glass years ago but still provided concealment while allowing observation of approaching vehicles. Elena's equipment included communications gear that would allow her to monitor federal law enforcement frequencies, along with defensive measures that would provide options if the meeting turned hostile. Agent Chun arrived exactly on time, accompanied by 2 other federal agents whose bearing suggested higher authority than typical field operatives. They approached the warehouse with the careful professionalism of people who understood they were meeting someone whose capabilities were unknown but potentially significant. Elena waited until the 3 agents had entered the building and positioned themselves in the main floor area she designated for the meeting. Then she made her way down the interior staircase, moving with the controlled silence of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on maintaining tactical advantage, even in supposedly friendly encounters. Agent Chun, Elena announced her presence from a position that provided cover while allowing conversation. She emerged from the shadows with her hands visible but ready to move if the situation required defensive action. Ms. Vasquez, Agent Chun's response was respectful but cautious, acknowledging Elena's obvious professionalism while maintaining appropriate distance. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. The 2 agents accompanying Chen were introduced as Deputy Director Morrison from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division and Colonel Sarah Palmer from Defense Intelligence Agency. Their presence indicated that Elena's assessment of the situation's significance had been accurate and that federal agencies were taking the pattern of attacks seriously enough to involve personnel with authority to make operational decisions. We appreciate your willingness to share information about these attacks. Deputy Director Morrison began, his tone suggesting someone accustomed to dealing with classified operations that couldn't be discussed in normal channels. Our investigation has confirmed that we're facing a coordinated threat that requires capabilities beyond conventional law enforcement response. Elena studied the three federal representatives, reading their body language and positioning to assess their intentions and the level of authority they actually possessed. Her response was designed to establish parameters for information sharing while maintaining her operational independence. Before we proceed, I need to understand the scope of your investigation and the resources you're prepared to commit to stopping these attacks. The people responsible have state-level financial backing and access to intelligence that suggests official support from hostile governments. Colonel Palmer stepped forward, her military bearing indicating someone who understood the operational realities Elena was describing. Our intelligence confirms your assessment. We're tracking financial transfers that originate from sources connected to foreign intelligence services, and the equipment used in recent attacks includes items that are restricted to military and intelligence applications. Elena nodded, understanding that the federal agencies possessed intelligence resources that could complement her operational capabilities. But she also understood that cooperation would require revealing aspects of her background that had been classified at levels above what these representatives might be authorized to access. The attacks are targeting former members of Task Force Omega, a special operations unit that was disbanded 3 years ago after completing classified missions in regions that officially don't exist on any government maps. Elena's revelation caused a subtle shift in the federal agents' postures, indicating that they recognized the significance of this information. Task Force Omega was responsible for operations that prevented several international incidents from escalating into larger conflicts. The people being targeted possess knowledge and capabilities that certain hostile governments would prefer to see eliminated. Deputy Director Morrison exchanged glances with Colonel Palmer, their silent communication suggesting that Elena's information confirmed intelligence they'd already developed through other sources. His response indicated that federal agencies were prepared to acknowledge aspects of the situation that couldn't be officially discussed. We're aware of Task Force Omega's existence and the sensitive nature of their operations. Our concern is that these attacks represent preparation for larger operations that could threaten national security if the people responsible aren't stopped. Elena understood that she'd reached the point where deeper cooperation would require trust that went beyond tactical considerations. The federal agencies possessed resources that could help identify and neutralize the threat, but using those resources would mean operating within constraints that might limit her effectiveness. I can provide intelligence about the network responsible for these attacks, but I need assurance that any operations conducted based on this information won't be constrained by oversight requirements that could compromise mission success. Agent Chun spoke for the first time since the introductions, her tone suggesting someone who understood the operational realities of fighting enemies, who didn't operate according to legal constraints. We're prepared to provide you with significant operational independence, along with intelligence support and tactical backup when needed. What we can't provide is complete autonomy or immunity from accountability if operations go beyond what can be officially supported. Elena considered the terms being offered, understanding that they represented the maximum cooperation she could expect from federal agencies that had to balance operational effectiveness against political and legal constraints. Her decision would determine whether the threat could be addressed through coordinated action, or whether she would continue operating independently. Acceptable. But I maintain command authority over any operations I conduct, and I reserve the right to terminate cooperation if federal oversight compromises mission effectiveness. The agreement reached. Deputy Director Morrison opened a briefcase that contained intelligence files related to the pattern of attacks against former Task Force Omega members. The information revealed a conspiracy that was more sophisticated and far-reaching than Elena had initially understood. The attacks were being coordinated by a network that included former intelligence operatives from multiple countries, funded through channels that connected to state-sponsored terrorism and organized crime syndicates. Colonel Palmer provided additional context that explained the strategic objectives behind the assassination campaign. Task Force Omega's operations had disrupted several international arms trafficking networks and prevented the transfer of advanced weapons technology to terrorist organizations. The people responsible for the current attacks were attempting to eliminate witnesses and participants who could testify about their activities. More importantly, the intelligence suggested that the assassination campaign was preparation for renewed operations that would require eliminating people whose knowledge and capabilities posed a threat to those plans. Elena understood that stopping the attacks wasn't just about protecting former Task Force Omega members, but about preventing larger operations that could affect national security. How many targets remain? Elena's question reflected her understanding. That time was a critical factor in preventing further attacks. Agent Chun consulted her files before responding with information that confirmed Elena's assessment of the situation's urgency. 12 former Task Force Omega members remain alive and potentially vulnerable to attack. 3 have been successfully relocated to secure facilities, but 9 others are living civilian lives with minimal security protection. Based on the pattern of previous attacks, we estimate that the next assault will occur within 72 hours. Elena processed this information, understanding that preventing further attacks would require proactive operations against a network that had demonstrated sophisticated planning and execution capabilities. The defensive approach of protecting potential targets wasn't sufficient when facing enemies who could adapt their tactics and wait for opportunities to strike. We need to go on the offensive. Identify the command structure coordinating these attacks and eliminate their operational capabilities before they can target additional personnel. Deputy Director Morrison nodded, indicating that federal agencies had reached similar conclusions about the need for proactive response. We've identified several facilities that serve as operational centers for the network responsible for the attacks. The problem is that these facilities are located in jurisdictions where traditional law enforcement can't operate, and military action would create diplomatic complications. Elena understood the implications of this limitation, recognizing that the situation required exactly the kind of operations that Task Force Omega had been created to conduct. Missions that operated in the spaces between law enforcement and military action, using people whose existence could be denied if operations created political complications. I can handle facilities that official agencies can't touch, but I'll need intelligence support and extraction resources if operations don't go according to plan. Colonel Palmer responded with the kind of authority that suggested she'd been authorized to commit significant resources to supporting Elena's operations. Full intelligence support, including real-time satellite surveillance and communications intercept capabilities. Emergency extraction resources will be positioned to provide assistance within 30 minutes of any operational area. Elena nodded, understanding that the level of support being offered represented a significant commitment from federal agencies that normally maintain strict oversight of operations conducted on foreign soil. The next phase of the conversation focused on operational planning and target selection, with federal intelligence being combined with Elena's knowledge of Task Force Omega's previous operations to identify the most critical nodes in the network responsible for the attacks. The primary target was identified as a private military compound in Montenegro that served as the coordination center for international operations. Intelligence indicated that the facility housed communication equipment, financial resources, and personnel files that would allow the network to continue targeting former Task Force Omega members indefinitely. Secondary targets included financial institutions in 3 different countries that provided funding channels for the assassination campaign, along with weapons storage facilities that supplied equipment for the attacks. Elena understood that simultaneous operations against multiple targets would be required to prevent the network from adapting and relocating their operations. Timeline for execution? Elena's question reflected her understanding that coordination would be critical to preventing the network from responding to initial attacks by accelerating their own operations against remaining targets. Deputy Director Morrison consulted with Colonel Palmer before responding with information that indicated federal agencies were prepared to move quickly once operational parameters were established. 48 hours for final planning and resource positioning. Operations commence at coordinates time to maximize impact and minimize opportunity for network response. Elena accepted the timeline, understanding that rapid execution would be essential to preventing the network from adapting their defenses or accelerating attacks against remaining Task Force Omega members. The meeting concluded with the establishment of secure communication protocols and coordination procedures that would allow real-time intelligence sharing during operations. As the federal agents departed the warehouse, Elena remained in position for another hour, monitoring communications and surveillance to ensure that the meeting hadn't been compromised by hostile observation. When she was satisfied that her operational security remained intact, she began the process of preparing for missions that would determine whether the assassination campaign could be stopped or whether it would continue until all former Task Force Omega members had been eliminated. The drive back to her safe house took Elena through mountain roads that provided opportunities to detect and evade any pursuit, while allowing time to consider the operational challenges ahead. The targets she would be engaging possessed professional military capabilities and would be expecting retaliation for their attacks against former Special Operations personnel. Success would require combining her individual skills with the intelligence and logistical support that federal agencies could provide, while maintaining the operational independence that was essential for missions that couldn't be constrained by normal oversight requirements. Elena understood that she was returning to the kind of operations that had defined her service with Task Force Omega, but this time the stakes included not just mission success, but the survival of people whose service had earned them enemies that operated without legal or political constraints. 48 hours later, Elena stood on a hillside overlooking the private military compound in Montenegro that served as the primary coordination center for the network responsible for attacking former Task Force Omega members. The facility was positioned in a valley that provided natural defensive advantages while offering concealment from casual observation. Intelligence provided by federal agencies had confirmed that the compound housed approximately 30 personnel with military training, along with communication equipment and financial resources that supported operations across multiple continents. The facility's security included perimeter sensors, armed patrols, and defensive positions that indicated professional planning and significant financial investment. Elena's approach to the compound utilized techniques that had been refined through years of conducting operations in hostile territory where detection meant mission failure and probable death. She moved through the surrounding forest with the controlled silence of someone who understood that survival depended on remaining invisible until the moment action was required. The operation began at 03:00 local time when federal agencies initiated coordinated strikes against financial institutions and weapons storage facilities that supported the assassination network. Elena's assault on the primary compound was timed to coincide with these attacks, preventing the network from coordinating response or relocating critical resources. What followed was a demonstration of the capabilities that had made Task Force Omega legendary within the Special Operations community. Elena penetrated the compound's defenses using techniques that combined stealth, infiltration with selective application of violence designed to neutralize threats while minimizing unnecessary casualties. The compound's communication center was her first objective, containing equipment that coordinated operations against former Task Force Omega members along with intelligence files that identified remaining targets and planned attack schedules. Elena's assault on this facility was swift and precise, disabling defensive systems and neutralizing security personnel before they could mount effective resistance. The intelligence recovered from the communication center revealed the scope of the conspiracy and confirmed that the assassination campaign was preparation for renewed operations that would require eliminating people whose knowledge posed a threat to those plans. Elena transmitted this information to federal agencies while continuing her systematic dismantling of the compound's operational capabilities. Her assault on the facility's command structure was conducted with the kind of surgical precision that left no doubt about her training and experience. The personnel responsible for coordinating attacks against former Task Force Omega members were neutralized with techniques that ensured they couldn't continue their operations while providing federal agencies with evidence that could be used to identify and prosecute other members of the network. The operation concluded with Elena's extraction from the compound area, supported by federal resources that had been positioned to provide assistance if the mission encountered complications. The intelligence recovered during the assault provided federal agencies with information needed to dismantle the remainder of the network while preventing future attacks against former Special Operations personnel. In the weeks that followed, coordinated operations by federal law enforcement and international partners resulted in the arrest of dozens of individuals connected to the assassination network, along with the seizure of financial assets and weapons, stockpiles that had supported operations across multiple countries. The threat to former Task Force Omega members was eliminated through actions that combined Elena's operational capabilities with the resources and authority of federal agencies. Elena's cooperation with federal law enforcement concluded with her return to civilian life, but with the understanding that her services might be required again if threats emerged that couldn't be addressed through conventional means. The arrangement provided her with the independence she required while giving federal agencies access to capabilities that existed outside normal oversight and accountability structures. The success of the operation established precedents for future cooperation between federal agencies and former Special Operations personnel, whose skills and experience were uniquely suited to addressing threats that operated in the spaces between law enforcement and military action. Elena's demonstration of those capabilities at a civilian training facility had led to recognition that some problems required solutions that couldn't be officially acknowledged. 6 months after the incident at Blackwater Ridge, Elena received a letter addressed to her current identity but delivered through channels that indicated federal intelligence community involvement. The message was brief and unsigned, but its content confirmed that the cooperation established during the Montenegro operation remained available if circumstances required it. The letter included newspaper clippings about the successful prosecution of international arms trafficking networks, along with a single photograph of a military cemetery, where flowers had been placed on graves marked only with numbers rather than names. Elena understood that the flowers represented recognition from people whose service couldn't be officially acknowledged, but whose sacrifice was remembered by those who understood the price of fighting wars that couldn't be publicly discussed. Elena folded the letter and placed it in a file with other communications that connected her to a community of people whose existence operated in the shadows between official oversight and necessary action. She understood that her service with Task Force Omega had ended, but that the obligations created by that service would continue as long as threats existed that required capabilities possessed by people whose training prepared them for missions that couldn't be officially conducted. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Elena's current residence, a small house in a quiet neighborhood where her neighbors knew her as someone who worked in computer security and kept to herself. The normalcy of her civilian life provided cover for someone whose real capabilities were known only to federal agencies that might require her services if conventional approaches proved inadequate. Elena returned to her daily routine of maintaining skills and monitoring intelligence sources that kept her informed about international developments that might affect national security. She understood that her cooperation with federal agencies during the Montenegro operation had established her as a resource that could be activated if circumstances required operations that couldn't be conducted through normal channels. The experience at Blackwater Ridge had demonstrated that her attempts to live a completely civilian life were complicated by enemies who didn't respect the boundaries between military service and civilian retirement. Elena accepted that her background would always make her a target for people whose operations were threatened by her knowledge and capabilities. But the successful elimination of the assassination network had also demonstrated that cooperation with federal agencies could provide resources and support that enhanced her effectiveness while maintaining the operational independence required for missions that operated outside normal oversight structures. Elena understood that this arrangement represented the best available balance between her need for autonomy and the government's need for capabilities that existed in the spaces between official acknowledgement and necessary action. The evening news included a brief story about the successful prosecution of an international conspiracy that had threatened national security, though the details were sufficiently vague to avoid revealing information that remained classified. Elena recognized the careful language that described operations without acknowledging the people who'd conducted them or the methods that had been used to achieve success. She understood that public recognition wasn't the goal of operations that protected people whose safety depended on remaining invisible. The satisfaction came from knowing that threats had been eliminated and that people could continue living their lives without facing enemies whose capabilities were supported by hostile governments and criminal organizations. Elena's phone rang with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize, but the encryption protocols indicated federal intelligence community involvement. The voice that greeted her was Agent Chun, whose tone suggested both professional respect and personal gratitude for the cooperation that had made the successful operation possible. Just wanted to let you know that the last of the network was rolled up today. 12 arrests across 4 countries, with financial assets seized that will prevent them from reconstituting their operations. Elena listened to the report with the satisfaction of someone who understood that complex threats required sustained effort to eliminate completely. Any indication of additional threats against former Task Force Omega personnel. Elena's question reflected her understanding that success in one operation didn't guarantee that other hostile networks wouldn't attempt similar campaigns. Agent Chun's response provided reassurance that federal agencies were monitoring for emerging threats while maintaining the intelligence-sharing relationships that had proven effective during the Montenegro operation. We're tracking several potential concerns, but nothing that rises to the level requiring immediate action. Your people should be able to return to normal lives without the security concerns they've been facing. Elena understood that normal life for former special operations personnel would always include awareness of threats that didn't affect ordinary citizens, but that the immediate danger of systematic assassination had been eliminated through actions that combined her capabilities with federal resources and authority. The conversation concluded with confirmation that secure communication channels remained available if future threats required coordination between Elena's operational capabilities and federal agency resources. The arrangement provided both sides with the flexibility needed to address emerging threats while maintaining the operational security required for missions that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Elena ended the call and returned to the quiet evening routine of someone whose day job involved computer security consulting for corporate clients, who had no idea that their consultant possessed capabilities that operated far beyond cybersecurity. The normalcy of her civilian life provided both cover and perspective, reminding her of what she was ultimately fighting to protect. The success of the operation against the assassination network had demonstrated that some threats could only be addressed by people whose training prepared them for missions that operated outside conventional constraints. Elena understood that her service to her country had evolved from military operations to a more complex arrangement that provided federal agencies with access to capabilities they couldn't officially possess. The arrangement satisfied her need to continue serving while providing the independence required for someone whose effectiveness depended on maintaining operational security that couldn't be subjected to normal oversight and accountability requirements. Elena accepted that this was the best available solution for someone whose background created both opportunities and obligations that would continue throughout her life. As night settled over her quiet neighborhood, Elena secured her residence, using procedures that had been refined through years of operating in hostile territory. Tomorrow would bring another day of maintaining the careful balance between civilian life and readiness for missions that might require capabilities that officially didn't exist. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.